Yeah, so I mean, none of these companies are making money, and they didn't go into this business with the intention of being profitable. They went into the business of breaking barriers.
Hello, everybody. I am Chris Harrison, host of the Chris Tech Chat. And in today's podcast, we have our guest, Dr. John Wensveen. He is the president of International Space University, ISU, out of Strasbourg, France. Also with me, we have our special invite and co-host for today, Mr. Julio Morales. Today, our topic of discussion and subject will be the impact of technology in the new space economy. Let me give the audience a little bit of background on John. John is an executive with an extensive experience in academia and higher ed. John today leads a premier global institution dedicated to space education, innovation, and international collaboration. As the president of International Space University, ISU, under his leadership, ISU has expanded its role as a catalyst for groundbreaking research and strategic partnership that shape the future of space exploration. Prior to ISU, John served as the Chief Innovation Officer at Nova Southeast University, where he spearheaded a multi-million-dollar innovation hub that attracted top entrepreneurs, cutting-edge technologies, and major investments. He has held leadership roles in academia, including Vice Provost of Miami-Dade College, Professor and Head of the School of Aviation at Purdue University, and Dean of Aviation at Dowling College. John's industry expertise spans aviation, aerospace, and business strategy, with executive roles at Mango Aviation Partners, Radix International, MaxJet Airways, and Canada 3000 Airlines. He is also a TEDx speaker, media contributor, an author of 2 leading industry books, including the bestseller Air Transportation: A Global Management Perspective. John holds a PhD and a master's degree from Cardiff University in the UK and a BA from the University of Victoria out of Canada. John, welcome to the Chris Tech podcast. And as we mentioned early on, we wanted to talk about you and get your thoughts on what is the impact of technology in the new space economy. And by the way, we're super excited to have you. Both Julio and I have crossed paths with you back in our previous life at NSU, Nova Southeast University. So we're excited to have you here on this podcast. We're happy on your new role, and we would love to share with the audience your thoughts on what is really the impact of technology in the new space economy.
Well, I appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you. I feel like I've just come back home after relocating to France from South Florida, so it's good to be with you guys, and look forward to our discussion today.
Absolutely. So give us what, obviously you spearhead premier leading institution, International Space University out of France, that is doing a lot of innovation, transformation, is preparing the future students for the space economy. You know, when you talk about this, you mentioned this, the new space economy. What are your thoughts? What's the vision of ISU? How do you see this, moving forward? And later on, we can talk about the impact of SpaceX into exploration and space, a little bit about AI. But from your lens, John, and all the years that you've had experience, you've been very close to space. I understand you're a pilot as well, so you've always been very close to space and aviation industries itself. From your lens, leading as a president for ISU, where do you see this going into the future, and how much of technology you think will have an impact on the new space of technology as compared to 5-10 years ago, where maybe it wasn't moving as fast as it is moving today, and where it's going to be moving in the next 5 to 10 years, probably at hyperspeed?
So hyperspeed is absolutely correct. And when you look at the forecasts about how fast space is accelerating in this age of mega disruption and acceleration, right now the space industry globally is worth a certain value, but it's going to double by 2040, perhaps even before that. It's going to be a $1 trillion. And I'm a little hesitant to use the word industry because, sort of like technology, there was a time when technology was an industry vertical, but it's not anymore, right? It's an economy, and everything is technology, and every business is technology enabled in some capacity or another. And space has traditionally been treated as an independent industry vertical, and it no longer is. So the terminology of a new space economy is quite frankly what it is. It's a brand new economy, and it's for what's happening here on Earth, but also inner and outer space applications. And there's never been a more opportune time for anybody to get involved in space and to pivot, especially for entrepreneurs. The barriers of entry are coming down all of the time. And what's really interesting is the International Space University was actually created by 3 MIT visionaries 37 years ago. And one of those visionaries, Peter Diamandis, is also the founder of the X Prize. If you're familiar with that at all, his vision led to the creation of the International Space University, which also led to the creation of Singularity University, which is based out of San Francisco, Silicon Valley area, and the model is actually replicated after the International Space University. And the goal of both of those organizations was to look at world challenges and then figure out, and I'm sorry that I have a phone ringing and it's my space line, and I apologize for that.
No worries.
It rings, it means it's important, so it's the bat line. But I'm on a more important thing right now with you guys. But what's interesting is the goal of these institutions and the visionaries was to figure out how you look at global challenges and implement strategic solutions. And if you could do it in 9 weeks or less and affect 1 billion people, what would that look like? And the 3 visionaries came together and said, look at the future of space. And one thing that doesn't exist in this world is an official university to support the space sector. Let's create it. So they incorporated a legal entity out of Webster, Massachusetts, near MIT. The legal entity still exists today after 37 years. And the goal was to go to the world and do a request for proposals where countries would bid on who would like to house the future International Space University, ISU. And it came down to a short list of contenders after a lot of due diligence, and really 3 different countries were on the radar screen, ranging from Japan to Canada to France. And at the time, it was the French government and local governments that stepped forward and said, you know, we'd like to house ISU, and we'd like to house it in Strasbourg, France. And the reason that Strasbourg was important is because it is technically the center of Europe. It's also where the European Parliament is headquartered. And interestingly enough, there are more consulate offices and embassies in Strasbourg than there is anywhere else in the world. So it's a huge political center. And at that time, the French government and other stakeholders had a fair amount of resources to say that we'll build you a campus free of charge, and we'll give you a long-term lease arrangement, and let's start it here. And with what the French were doing and what Europe was doing in space at that time was amazing. It really was one of the core focus areas next to what NASA was doing here in the United States. And I essentially planted the flag and was created. And the goal of the university was to create the future space leaders, but also work with the current space leaders. And in today's language, it would be workforce and new skilling and upskilling and reskilling, but to create a model that was based on what they call 3 I's, which still is part of the DNA today. And the 3 I's are international, intercultural, and interdisciplinary. And that's embedded in all of the academic and professional development programs, the culture of the university. And here we are 37 years later, and in the space sector today, there are more than 6,000 people that are in the top level leaderships of space around the world, where we interact with more than 113 countries as of right now, where most of those leaders of space agencies, big space companies, investment firms have come through our programs. And the world of space is small. I come from the world of aviation and aerospace, which is also small, but space is even smaller, despite the universal application, and everybody knows everybody. And we have the largest space network in the world, which is super impressive. And I can call anybody at any time for any kind of a need that you could imagine, literally anywhere around this world, or to the International Space Station, which we've done. And the idea here was to create a university that was neutral to all countries, no matter what the political challenges might be, even to this day. And it's sort of a UN, if you will, of universities that support space. And it was really designed for peaceful purposes. So how do we utilize this resource to keep peace around the world and in space? And the original concept of the university, because nobody knew what the future was going to look like in reality, was that it was designed to help support the public sector, i.e. the space agencies. So the major investors became the European Space Agency, as an example, NASA, and several other space agencies which still support us to this day, and new space agencies that are being created, they're happening almost every day in this crazy world. And we still live by the DNA in which we were originally created. And after 37 years, the board recognized that it was time to pivot and really look at the future. And interestingly enough, it's a story that I have no problem telling people, is that I applied to become the president of the International Space University twice before over the last decade. And I was one of the 2 finalists in the first 2 runnings. And they always went with the European Space Agency senior executive skill set mindset network. And I always said from the beginning that this university is not an academic institution in the sense of what one traditionally is known as. We're very unique and different with the types of programs that we offer. And it's time to have a CEO of a business, not the president of a university, and here's why. So last July, I got a call, funny enough, while I was on a safari in South Africa. My technology wasn't working, and the chairman of the board is trying to reach me, and I'm not responding to any of his communications. And he's like, if you're not interested, at least let us know. I didn't know he was trying to reach me. So, after a week of being on safari, I finally get in touch. I'm like, hello. And we negotiated a deal. And they basically said the time is right for you now. We weren't ready for you then. And we need the CEO. And we need to think about the future. So we came in with this mindset that was very similar to what I did in my previous role as the Chief Innovation Officer at Nova Southeastern University and Executive Director of the Levant Center of Innovation, to assume that the future's here now and then ask the question, what are we doing about it? So now we're pivoting for the next 30 years of our growth, which is really focused on supporting the new space economy, knowing that the private sector and commercialization of space is now the engine that drives the train versus the public sector. And the public sector is more like the caboose of the train that's supporting it from the other side of the wall. So that it's the whole sector has pivoted, and we need to accelerate into that future so that we're more focused on innovation, technology, entrepreneurship, which is building organizations from within. And that's what we're now doing with a new strategic plan called the Moonshot 2030 strategy, which is the most in-depth strategic plan that's ever been designed in 37 years that allows us to actually support that new space economy moving forward, and to do so not just here on Earth, but actually in space.
So, John, sounds like ISU is sort of the International Space Station that wants to be neutral to the world, wants to allow and collaborate with international universities, students, and create sort of an ecosystem around the new space economy. And also sounds like ISU is sort of the catalyst for other space universities to be able to build upon, right? Sounds like you guys were pioneering that, as it's no longer a sector, right? An industry, it's a whole ecosystem, it's a whole economy around that.
Yeah, for several years, there wasn't another resource like this. It was very independent. And then, of course, as the world has evolved and technology has evolved, the competitive forces have also evolved. So there are several space programs offered by universities and colleges and training organizations around the world. We still remain the most influential and powerful of them all, but it has been noticed that there's a need, and that need to me is needed. And I don't view anybody as like a competition. I think we have to be collaborators. And that's the one thing that you learn about space. It's the one sector that brings everybody together, no matter what your feelings are, again, for peaceful purposes. And you are forced to work together. So when you think about the International Space Station, I think that is probably the most valuable asset that exists in humanity right now in terms of showing how different cultures and politics can come together to work as one. Because if you have a dysfunctional team, you're not going to be able to live. And the research doesn't continue. So it's extremely important. And as far as I'm concerned, they should get the Nobel Peace Prize. And I don't know if an actual asset has ever been the recipient, but I believe in it that strongly. And when I look at space as an economy, it is truly the one that is happening, in quotes, at the fastest rate compared to anything that exists. So we can talk about emerging technologies, but emerging technologies are space, and space is emerging technologies, those that we know of and those that we don't know of yet. But to kind of get back to your initial comment, we've been the leader and hope to continue to be the leader that drives the space education and awareness sector, if you will, in collaboration with the public and private sectors, which we've done and will continue to do as we move forward. But now we have to adapt to the new types of stakeholders that are out there that didn't exist 5 years ago, 2 years ago. And if you're watching what happened in the world of space over the last month, there have been more things, accomplishments, and there's been some failures. But space has been in the media every single day. And one of the more exciting things that just happened was this last Friday is the first data center was landed on the moon. And it took multiple organizations to make that happen in the public and private sector. And I'm really proud to say that every single one of those organizations that made that happen has the alumni of the International Space University on the team. Every single one of those companies that made that happen. And that's sort of the power of our network. And when you ask anybody that's gone through an academic program or a professional development program or our space studies program, which is our headliner that we do annually somewhere in the world, they said the most powerful thing I developed was the network. And it's that network that I live with today and continue to grow. And it's in person. We don't do a lot of virtual stuff versus others that are. because that in-person connection of the space network truly is a life-changing experience for those. And these are the people you hire, you fire, you marry, you divorce, invest in, etc. It's a huge family.
John, so your programs are pretty much face-to-face. They're on premises. They're not virtual, like typical asynchronous careers that other universities offer, right?
Yeah, I know what the trends are, and yes, you have to do that virtual online programming component, but International Space University is a little bit different in the sense that we're not as dependent upon that, except when COVID happened. Of course, the university had to pivot, as everybody else did, to take that virtual world into successful environments, and we do some of that, and we were doing that prior to and we still offer some short courses and programs virtually, but that's not what the market is. It's truly getting all of us together in a room, whether it's an executive space course, which usually lasts 4 to 5 days, or it's our big program, which is our space studies program, which is 9 weeks in length, and it's always somewhere in the Northern Hemisphere. It's an open bid for countries. And then the Southern Hemisphere space studies program, which takes place in Adelaide, Australia, which is the center of space for the Southern Hemisphere every year, every January. Then we have a master's program, actually two, a Master of Space Studies and a Master of Science in Space Studies. One is accredited and one is not accredited on purpose, and slightly different curriculums at the end of the day, but everything is done in person.
Yeah, it's more in person than online, I guess.
It's the power of connectivity. And if you think about, here we are doing a virtual connection, and we're definitely connected, but if we were together in the same studio, then we even have a stronger connection, and you can read each other, we get to know each other. And part of our international, interdisciplinary, intercultural interface is that our programs don't just entail being in a classroom. It's field trips to space infrastructure. It's bringing in keynote speakers, getting you outside of the classroom, actually living and breathing, and then the social, cultural networking component of it. So when you're in a program, it's morning, noon, and night, and you're working together, but you're developing friendships, you're developing professional networks that literally last forever. And imagine that you had an opportunity to go to the International Space University to find out that your chancellor was Buzz Aldrin, or you got to interact with Stephen Hawking,
Wow.
or
Same.
the author of 2001: A Space Odyssey, Clark. Those are the types of people that you're traditionally interacting with, and when in today's world, when you think about the Bezos, the Musks, the Bransons of the world that are creating these companies, you have an opportunity to interact with these organizations and many of these leaders. And when I was a kid, it was a dream to meet an astronaut. Now I get to talk to astronauts every single day, and
What a job, man.
as
What a
part
job.
of it, it's amazing,
Wow.
right?
Yeah. John, that leads to my next question, which I think you're starting to allude into it. From your perspective, how much of an impact you believe companies like SpaceX are making in accelerating space endeavors, explorations, professional opportunities, NASA's own program, and certainly ISU's program itself? The last few years, we've seen an acceleration of new programs, being able to have reusable rockets and things like that we haven't seen in the past. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, none of these companies are making money, and they didn't go into this business with the intention of being profitable. They went into the business of breaking barriers. And when you think about the billionaires behind the big space companies that we know, like the SpaceX's and the Virgin Galactics and the Blue Origins of the world, what a lot of people don't recognize is that, okay, you may have those big three, but do you know how many other hundreds of smaller private companies are out there that are doing the same things, or the contributors to these big brands in terms of components and research and development, etc.? And what's amazing in this time in history is that there's never been so much activity in the world of space as there is right now, and it's only going to continue. One of the things that I've always sort of prided my own self on was looking at the future to look at trends so that we can adapt to them today, but not to be just a futurist, but an applied futurist. And that's the new culture and mindset that we're bringing into the International Space University as well. And the idea here is to be able to look into the short, medium, and long term to figure out what those trends are so that we can start creating the infrastructure, the programming, the services to be able to support that immediately. And we fully recognize that the smaller private space companies or companies that can pivot to become a space company, the opportunities are bigger and better than they've ever been before. And the investment dollars are there. And it was interesting to me in my last role when I tried to bring space to South Florida, and I was laughed out of I don't know how many offices between Miami-Dade County, Broward County, Palm Beach County. And instead of asking, hey, would you like to be involved? I took a stance one day and said, you know what, we're going to plant the space flag in South Florida through the Nova Southeastern University Levant Center of Innovation. We got several government proclamations to create Space Day and etc., and just said, you know what, we're going to do it. And the problem is that a lot of industries, individuals don't realize that they can be a space company or that they can contribute to space in some form or fashion. And that's the mindset starting to change. And if you look at what's going on in Florida right now, and with Space Florida, which is basically the ambassador for space in our state, the economic development engine that drives space, all of a sudden you see an increased presence in the South Florida market and other parts of the state because they realize as well that the entire state can support space directly and indirectly. And it's not just Florida, it's happening in multiple states across the country and of course other countries around the world. But it's a pivotal time because it's the R&D that's being accelerated and it's being funded and it's trial and error. And candidly, we're going to have more failures than we are going to have successes. But if we don't have that, we're never going to be able to progress.
It's okay, right?
It's definitely okay. And you learn from these mistakes. And yes, it's a shame to see things get blown up and millions and billions of dollars, go down the drain. But that's what advances humanity to get to the next level. And for those that are not familiar with space, I'm asked pretty much daily, well, why are we investing all this time and energy and all these resources into space? What's the point of it all? Why aren't we solving other problems here on Earth? And what a lot of people don't recognize is that the advancement of space will help solve many of the problems that we have here on Earth, humankind issues, environmental issues, financial issues, population issues,
sustainability,
agricultural, sustainability.
Long-term.
And what happens? I mean, the Earth isn't going to be here forever. At some point in time, it implodes, right? It's not sustainable no matter what you do, but we take active measures. But space and the use of satellites, especially the new evolving sat tubes, mini sats that are more affordable than ever before, and constellations, can look at things like rising tides. We can look at heat maps. We can look at population growth. We can look at ag tech challenges as an example so that we can make better informed decisions about what we're doing. But also, how do we put constellations in space? How do people live and work in space? What kind of resources and tools do we need in space for Earth observation, which is huge? What can we utilize the moon for, whether it's colonies, research, data centers, a waypoint for refueling, as an example? Mars, is it going to happen? The answer is yes. There's already stuff happening on Mars. Are we going to be living there anytime soon? Probably not. But we're taking multiple steps to make that happen and colonize, because it is about humanity and survival at the end of the day. That's why these resources are going into space.
The future.
I'm shifting a little bit into your world as president of ISU. What, from your perspective, what are the careers in the space industry in the next 5-10 years that are going to be in high demand in there? And how well is your institution preparing for enabling those future scientists and space professionals to be able to match the needs and demand of that space economy ecosystem?
Well, traditionally, ISU has really been the go-to resource that takes all the disciplines and tries to roll it all into one learning experience. So we deal with everything from the whole STEM side of space, but also bringing in space policy, entrepreneurship, liberal arts as a component to it. And a lot of people don't know that our first introduction to space was actually through the arts. And it was the days of Da Vinci and drawing spacescapes and looking at stars and planets and going back hundreds of years ago. And that's where it really originated. And we often forget about that. But in terms of career trajectories, again, it's looking at the public sector and the private sector and dividing that into different sections because there are evolving needs on both sides. My biggest concern is that we don't have a lot of knowledge and awareness, and they're not doing a lot yet about space policy and regulations. And that's going to determine what kind of career trajectories and skill sets are required when we know what the laws are. And the problem is there's a lot of parties that are talking, and I'm part of these global conversations with several organizations, is that there isn't a universal space law. And it's also the same thing for aviation on Earth, which is complicated enough. Now imagine going up there into space, and space is divided into 3 worlds. It's LEO, MEO, and GEO. It's low Earth orbit, middle Earth orbit, and then what we call geostationary orbit. So it's divided by mileage or kilometers or nautical miles, if you will, different rings in space. And each one of these zones will need its own policies and procedures that are in place. So that's a career trajectory in its own right.
Wow.
Space policy, regulations, the legal aspects, processes that need to go into place. The thing is, of course, engineers, but the type of engineer is now also beginning to change because of the way that technology is changing. Things around AI in space, cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking in generic terms because there's multiple professions under each one of these types of headings that are moving forward. Even in the investment world, the venture capital market, the angel investment markets, the financial institutions that have to fund. You think about liability and insurance. Well, who's underwriting these satellites, these space vehicles, the individuals that are going to space? These are opportunities. Other ones that I'm really excited about, and it may be a little far-fetched, but it's really not, it's space weather and solar storms. And what's a solar storm? And space junk colliding with each other.
Debris flying all over.
Debris flying.
Right.
And that impacts here on Earth. So imagine if you could create a company, and there is one that I'm working with right now out of Luxembourg, that is creating a technology where they launch satellites that collect data, and the goal is to sell the data to industry verticals like aviation. So I could sell it to an airline, and the airline will now have forecasted data that predicts when a solar storm is going to happen because it impacts operations or navigational challenges, as an example,
or performance
to help
on an
make
aircraft.
the money. Exactly, performance. So those types of things that are existing out there. And then, of course, there's the whole education side of it as well. And how do we educate? How do we train? What kind of skill sets, credentials are going to be required for space? And coming out of my last role, I was pretty heavily involved in emerging tech. And if you just look at cybersecurity as one example, the demand for skilled people in cybersecurity versus the talent that's readily available is a huge gap. And when you look at space, it's even bigger. And when you ask an executive, a C-level, a CEO of a space company, what's your biggest concern? What keeps you up at night? And it's two things that are common in almost every conversation. It's cybersecurity and it's skill talent. Where am I going to get it? For the current workforce and then the future workforce, and the new skilling, the upskilling and the reskilling. So there's a huge opportunity for someone to fill that void.
So in the ISU, you're preparing students for these different disciplines and skills to be ready for that, for the NASAs and the X's and the Virgins, right?
Absolutely. And all these private companies, but if you actually look at their workforce right now, you'd be surprised how young the people are in these organizations, right? They're literally just getting them out of school as quickly as possible, the smart ones that can think space, and there just aren't enough people to fill the seats that are needed. So there's always a job opportunity available in space, and it's global. It's very universal in nature. And if we were to talk 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about careers that we didn't even know existed. It's beyond our comprehension because it's happening so fast and new things will evolve. But there's the traditional way of getting in space, but there's going to be the non-traditional way, which is really emerging. And it's not always a university degree. It's not an engineering certification, as an example. It's a different type of skill set that's going to be required from different angles. And when you think just about design and test and build of technology, whether it's something that's flying or it's a component, how many other subsets of careers are required for each one of those down below? And I was very fortunate just a month ago to visit a space agency in North Africa that's considered to be the forefront of the Middle East, North Africa region right now. And I walked through this 200-acre walled compound where they're literally building a space city. And the infrastructure is, some of it's already in existence, some of it is still under development. But I got to walk through the space infrastructure, multiple buildings where you design satellites, you build the satellite, you test, and then you launch. And it was empty. There was nothing going on. And the reason being is they can't find people to actually do all the different stages to do it. Yeah.
This is starting to remind me of when we all joined IT way back in the day, but there was not enough IT personnel.
So it sounds like, John, and you, from your perspective, the biggest demand will not be coming from the Virgin Galactic or SpaceX of the world. It's the smaller companies that contribute to the overall space exploration and development, all that, which is going to be hundreds of companies around the world, right? That help or participate or provide, or they're a provider or a service or a product to the larger company. That's where you think the biggest demand will come.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like the airline industry. You hear about the world's biggest brands, but we don't hear about a lot of those other brands that are the greater proportion of the population. And it's the same thing with space. Yes, you see these big brands, and there are more and more that are being recognized all of the time. But it's the unknowns that aren't in everyday media that are also the huge contributors to this driving force moving forward. And if I was in an elevator and I had 30 seconds to say, okay, well, what's really the main opportunity around space? How do I be successful? It's really going to be around data. So am I the one that's building the machines to collect the data, to analyze the data or interpret the data? but technology is needed because data is the gold rush. That's the most valuable asset that we're going to have. And how do we use that data? And then think about, okay, well, what am I allowed to do? What am I not allowed to do? That's where the policy, the law, the regulations, the use of technologies like AI become extremely important as we move forward. And another thing, too, that I didn't think about that I probably should have mentioned, too, is it's the future of transportation for the public sector. And you think about aviation and how airlines and airports have built over time. The next evolution is spaceports. And there are about 200 spaceports around the world. And it doesn't mean you necessarily launch a vehicle, because you can be a spaceport without launch capabilities. It could be observation capabilities, as an example. And I'm observing satellites in space, or rockets in space, if you will. And if you think about spaceports, that's the next evolution of an airport, where there will be a time where we're launching vehicles on an hourly basis throughout the day, just as we launch airplanes from airports throughout the day. So we've taken a very bold step forward. I made an announcement in October at a very big space event. Funny enough, it was in Orlando, and partnered with an organization called the Global Spaceport Alliance, which is relatively new and growing annually. And together we said, well, you know what, we're going to come up with the world's first program in spaceport management and operations and spaceport leadership. And we're now designing and building out those programs so that we can serve the evolving spaceport sector, which is really the next evolution of my growth, going from airlines and airports now into spaceports as part of my portfolio. And we can take this worldwide. And that's a huge career trajectory for people as well, about what a spaceport is, how it's an economic development engine for a region, and the impact, the employment opportunities, the capabilities of what they can do. But it also brings up the subject of hypersonic travel. So we're going to have commercial airplanes that essentially become space planes that fly at higher altitudes and at greater speeds over greater distances. So can I get from New York to London in 90 minutes or 2 hours and surpass anything the Concorde ever had the ability to do? From a technology perspective, yes. The reality of it is a little bit different, sort of like electric vehicles. The infrastructure is not there, but the technology kind of is. So those are the things that we're focusing on, and you're going to see more funding behind that kind of transportation as well.
John, since you have a world view on the space economy, where it's heading into, especially from the academia side of it, and certainly from a talent perspective, how to build that talent pipeline to be able to achieve the objectives where the market's heading into. Your thoughts on, are certain markets or certain continents more aware of space and where it's heading into, and the space economy? You see the Western countries, or the US or Asia, or the Middle East, more advanced and really keeping more an eye, being more aware of it, and putting more pressure into advancing technologies and the space exploration and things like that than others? Because obviously you're sitting in the middle of it, right? So you have your global view on it, and you have a pulse on it. You see certain markets that are really more keen, aware, and really understanding the value of why they should be doing the things that you're doing versus others?
Yeah, absolutely. So the great thing about the seat that I sit in and our team sits in is that we get access to everything and anything, essentially, and working with every country you can imagine. So personally, what I've done is I've broken the world into 6 geographic regions: North America, Latin America, Caribbean, Asia Pacific, Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And if you look at where traditional space sector infrastructure has grown in interest, it's basically been North America and Europe. And now when you look at the rest of the world, it's everywhere. And Africa, which has traditionally been at the end of the list in terms of the ability to evolve, all of a sudden is projecting itself into space. So there's the newly created African Space Agency, which is representative of several of the African countries. Over 30 are now participants. Plus they have their own independent space agencies that are all of them are fairly new, but they're getting into the world of space, and then they see what the value of it is. And there's almost like a land grab that's going on right now around the world, where I need to have my piece of space if I'm going to be a part of it. And you see independent countries creating their own space agencies, but then you see consortiums of space agencies, even in Europe. Yes, different countries have their own space agency, but then they also belong to the European Space Agency as a consortium member state type model. When you look at the Middle East, it's huge. They're pouring money into space. And when you look at Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Qatar, as an example, the money is probably more available there than it is anywhere else in the world. And they want to be dominant players in the space sector. And if I'm chasing dollars right now, that's the part of the world that would be going.
That's where you're going. Wow.
Interesting. Yeah. John, this is, we're at about 47 minutes into it, 45 minutes, 40 minutes into it. This has been, at least for myself, it's been mind-boggling and incredibly thought-provoking on your experience and what you're leading and what you're doing currently at ISU and your thoughts on the space economy. I think this is going to be of a great value and interest for our audience. I think we can sit here for hours, and one of the things we like to do is maybe towards the end of the year, as you get even more settled in and tons of millions of miles more of traveling because of your duties in place in there, we'd like to have you come back here and share your thoughts again. But this has been incredibly thoughtful and mind-boggling to understand what you're doing, what your role, and really from your lens, what is really the impact of technology in this new space economy, which is not a sector like you said. It isn't, and it's huge, and it's here to stay, and it's here to grow over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. So, John, any last minute comments you want to just close it up before we finish our podcast?
Well, sure, Chris, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, and any chance we get to just create education and awareness about everything space is always wonderful. I do look forward to returning. It'll probably be from some different country in the world at that point.
Out of space, maybe. You never know.
You never know. Maybe we'll have some news to share the next time that we meet about something that's on the radar screen for me in space travel related. But
Wink, wink.
I think, wink, wink. But, I guess it's an important thing to leave with is that there are some interesting trends that are going on, and people should really start to focus on what's going on with the moon economy, which is a subset of the new space economy, because you're going to see a lot more interest in what's happening on the moon. In-space manufacturing and how you utilize those resources are huge opportunities, because you can't just create everything on Earth and then launch into space, right? You got to have stations in space that do different things. And I think maybe when we talk next time, some focus on AI and robotics, because that's going to be an important aspect of where space goes to in the future. And then I mentioned briefly environment, but space and climate change is huge, which is one of the big sectors of investment for Earth observation. And you're going to hear the term Earth observation more than you've ever heard before. But I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys. And as you said, we can speak for hours and look forward to our round two.
I got one last question, John. Is space really the final frontier?
No, it's just the start of the next frontier.
There you go.
Yeah. And, the one question that keeps me up every single night, and I know I'm never going to get the answer to, does space end? I am mind boggled with that question.
How infinite it is, right?
Well, what's interesting? We seem to know more about space than we do know what's happening in our oceans. And what's interesting is space is going to allow us to evolve so that we learn more about our oceans and what happens underneath the seas.
Love it. This has been great. John, this has been wonderful. I appreciate having you and spending the time. I know you're a very busy man. You travel the world. You run a very important international space university. But thank you for your time. I think this has been super helpful, insightful, thought-provoking, as I mentioned before. We look forward to having you in the near future, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thanks for joining us, John.